Today's World Insight, a review into the Phase 1 trade deal postponed. Does trade offer a ray of hope while other aspects of bilateral ties break apart? And Trump and Pompeo call for an ideological Cold War between China and the U.S. Can cooperation prevail over competition? I speak to a Chinese scholar who advocates political wisdom to rise above the choppy discourse.
The sitting government, increasingly frustrated about the performance, will make those decision-making on China even more dramatic.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. A review of the China-U.S. Phase 1 trade deal has been postponed over the weekend. The last official communication between the top negotiators between the two sides was a phone call in May. Since the deal was signed in January, trade tensions have shifted from the U.S. trade deficit to Chinese tech companies' access to the U.S. market. How important is reviewing the current deal to progressing towards future trade deals? A discussion with our panelists from both sides. For China-U.S. trade issues in New York, we have Max Wolf, who is a managing partner at Multivariate. In Washington, D.C., we are joined by Yukong Huang, senior fellow from Asia Program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Last but not least, in Beijing, Yao Yang, director of the China Center for Economic Research with Peking University. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. I could hardly catch up with the latest news, and the latest news suggests this round of discussion between China and the United States regarding trade and economic ties, particularly for the first phase, didn't happen. So, Mr. Huang, your assessment of the latest.
Well, I think I would say that we've moved from what I would call a trade war to decoupling. It began a couple years ago with tariffs. And at that time, the major concern in the White House was China should buy more. The business community was about getting better access to China's market, unfair competition, technology transfer, restrictive practices. That's what the business community was concerned about. And then you have what I call the security establishment. Mm-hmm. And there were a lot of conflict between two great powers, and increasingly security concerns and decoupling with China. I think today what you're seeing today is that the trade issues have actually receded in terms of priority. And there's much more concern about separating the two economies. And that means essentially decoupling China from access or contact with America in terms of technology, information flows, finance, and even people.
That was apparently the intention Mr. Huang read about the current administration's decision toward China. Professor Yao in Beijing, does trade and economic ties still matter when the two countries do not have much common ground, at least for now? Would trade and economic ties still be an area that the two should work together?
Since the first phase agreement was signed, so many things have happened. In particular, the United States has ratcheted up pressure, and even so-called new Cold War on China. And I think without talking about the current situation, going back to the trade deal sounds like being sidetracked, right? So I think both countries probably want to deal with the current issues, the more pressing issues first. China is still implementing the first phase agreement, but of course, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the pace has been slowed down. But if you look at the data, U.S.-China trade has come back, right? Increased over last year. So that's a good sign. But I don't think substantial progress will be made until the election day.
Mr. Wolf, you've been listening to your colleagues. Tell me more about your assessment. Particularly, you are now doing your job regarding, technology security and its ties to the economic situation. Tell me more about your thoughts.
Yeah, so I don't think I disagree substantially. I think that the U.S. business community remains in a sort of strange denial place where they had a set of uninspired, not particularly unusual requests. They wanted to get better prices and sell more to China when this began, and they liked the idea that this president had promised them an ability to cut deals, despite the fact that his career is replete with examples of him being one of the world's least successful businessmen and deal cutters. And unfortunately, we got the Donald Trump of history, not the Donald Trump of promise. All of our major trading partners, our relationships are substantially worse. China, most importantly, I think that's true. And I don't think it's easy to be hopeful before later November.
It's important as to where China and the United States are likely to go in the near future or the long term, because what's going on now certainly going to lay a foundation about the future. Talking about the U.S. domestic challenges, the U.S. federal government has run deficit every year since 2002. The deficit began to widen dramatically in April as the government started spending billions of dollars on coronavirus relief and stimulus package. And many wonder that whether in the next few months the two parties are going to come to any conclusion about the relief fund. Having said that, though, Mr. Huang, will starting a Cold War with China help the United States, even in the short term, be able to solve some of the problems?
If you go back a year ago and you think about the trade war, and then you look at what's been happening over the last 6 or 7 months, most people now realize that the trade war caused America to incur a lot of pain with not much gain. So that's not really a politically win-win for the President Trump in terms of the elections. But now he's moved on to what I call a tech war, decoupling from China. And decoupling from China, potentially in the short run, helps America in terms of perceptions that they're gaining and they're not actually losing. Much of the cost is being borne by China. Now, in the long run, both sides lose. But in the short run, America has a lot to gain politically by seemingly separating from China. And the Trump administration is heavily motivated by trying to put forward a very broad array of policies so that no matter who wins in November, even if Biden wins, the relationship between the U.S. and China will actually become worse and deteriorate. And I think this is a major concern for everybody. These negative sentiments toward China are not just the Trump administration sentiments. They're strong, what I call critical negative sentiments, even in the Democratic Party. So when President Trump moves forward with what I call these harsh actions against China, he actually has pretty broad support within the general U.S. Political system. If I had to characterize Trump's policies, I would say that his policies are what I call chaotic decoupling. But if I had to characterize the Democratic administration's policies, generally speaking, I would say that they've been practicing what I call a form of containment with hedging. There's a slight difference between decoupling and containment with hedging. Containment with hedging allows a little bit more of a dialogue, a little bit more of a negotiation. So in that sense, I think a Biden administration actually offers a little bit more opportunity for what I call constructive discussions between China and the United States. But a process of chaotic decoupling does not. And I think this is a very narrow path that people have to work on for the future.
So now, when the ball is being kicked to the court of China, how much can China do? What tools does China still have in hand? We noticed that China has toned down its approach toward the United States, not 100% tit for tat and rhetoric wars, but something else. Tell me more about what's your feeling and assessment.
To some extent, the Trump administration really wants to make China angry so he can gain from this perceived fight with China in the general election. But of course, there could be a kind of a longer term purpose in all this kind of dealings with China. But one of the possibility is that Trump is going to lose the election, so his administration wants to make a chaotic relationship between the United States and China, and force the next administration to be tougher on China. But from the China side, I think we still have a lot of tools in the toolbox, and China hasn't used any of it. China's attitude toward the U.S. currently is that we should sit down and talk. But this time, the two parties didn't get together and talk. I think that was quite a regret.
Chinese economy talking about dual circulations. Mainly it's about bringing up the domestic demand and make sure if the outer circulation, its connection with the rest of the world, particularly with the United States, didn't work as well as wanted to be, how China's economy could still prosper. So, Professor, tell me about how it would work, and will it work?
I think that the dual circulation is, I think, a pragmatic recognition that the world has changed. So you cannot rely upon foreign trade and foreign investment as a growth engine, as was the case decades ago. So the discussion then focuses on what can you do in terms of domestic activity. And of course, trying to keep consumption strong and aggregate demand strong is part of the solution. But consumption doesn't drive growth.
No.
What drives growth ultimately is investment and productivity increases. And the key issue then for China is how do I increase productivity in this global environment? And I think part of it is the effort of the government to basically push and support new technologies. But you can only go so far on that because the benefits from that don't really show up in the near term. So a lot more has to be focused upon what you do in terms of domestic investment. And infrastructure, of course, is something the government is looking at. But you have to think about doing infrastructure in a way that generates greater returns than in the past. So a combination of investment, but more productive investment, technology, innovation, along with trying to keep making sure that consumption and household demand remains strong in the coming months or years is what I think the solution is.
It depends on the purpose of dual circulation. If its purpose is for long-term economic growth, right, then we have to focus on technological progress and investment. But I think the current situation in China is that we still have a lot of flags, right? We still have a lot of idle equipment. We still have unemployed people. So in that case, consumption can be a short-term driver for economic growth. So focusing on boosting domestic consumption is a good strategy, at least for the short run.
But many wonder whether people really would like to consume given the uncertainty.
Yeah, that's actually the biggest challenge in China, right? The future is not clear whether the pandemic is going to disappear soon. We don't know. So that's why people still saving more. You look at the China's saving rate, it's actually increasing. But if we look at the lower end of the income distribution, those people at the lower end actually don't have enough income. So that's why for the last several months, I always tell the government should give those people cash transfer so we can boost the consumption.
Global supply chain, Mr. Wolf, you talk about that. Your thoughts and assessment of the realities now?
That trade and financing partners are not fungible. So if you lose relationships with $1 trillion economy, you cannot substitute $330 billion economies, right? So things are very specific, and we see clusters of specialization, whether that's financing, advertising, marketing, shipping, and I think we're starting to see disruption. I think the hundreds of millions of clients potentially of Huawei parts, I think the users of ByteDance's TikTok, and I think that the coming back and forth, as well as American farmers and some Chinese food consumers, are beginning. They're the beginning of what is going to be a long process. Because I agree with my colleagues about a decoupling, but it took 40 difficult subsidized years to build the architecture that people are now disorderly tearing down in months. And when you attempt to tear out pieces of something that took years to build with crude tools over months, there's always more damage than there is precision. And I think sadly that is the future of the supply chains around the world, at least for years, because the adjustments are difficult and imperfect.
Mr. Huang, there were news suggesting that the Trump administration boasting about trying to provide the financial aid to companies that are moving their businesses into the United States, particularly away from China. Meanwhile, it seems that the U.S. is trying to showcase its muscle of pressuring the global supply to change by cracking on Huawei, by cracking on TikTok and WeChat, and probably the list goes on, some of the bigger companies in China. So that brings us to another question, which is whether the really global internet rules and atmosphere and way of doing things will be changed forever as a result of this.
The problem here, broadly speaking, is sharing the information, whether it's data or knowledge. We've gone through, I would say, a couple of generations of which the focus was the exchange of knowledge and information was seen as good for everybody. And their concern now is maybe we're sharing too much information. So what you see in the U.S. Beginning is let's slow down the transfer of knowledge to the world. And personally, I think that's a very bad thing because it essentially means slower growth for everybody. When you say, I don't want TikTok operating or WeChat in the U.S., or I don't want U.S. companies to be able to continue to be listed in American exchanges, essentially what you're seeing is a policy of cleaning out any major Chinese presence in the United States. And I think that is a major move, and I think it has a lot of detrimental aspects. Now, as Max says, you can't actually change fundamentally the relationship or decouple quickly because the American presence in China is huge. You have about $700 billion of assets of American companies in China. It generated about $500 billion of sales revenue. That's in China. In that sense, I don't think the administration wants to disturb that because that generates returns back to the States. But a Chinese presence, a visible Chinese presence in the United States is something which America wants to actually get rid of. And I think these are very harmful actions that need to be monitored.
Global supply chain, China is proud of it, Professor Yao being part of it. What plan could China have? Or have to wait out the general election in the U.S. Before any concrete specific plans?
First of all, we have to do a reality check to see if the global production chain has been broken, particularly when it comes to do with China. I think the answer is no. If you look at the trade data, China-U.S. trade has increased over the last year. China became America's largest trading partner again in April after last year's drop. So U.S.-China, at least on the trade level, the ties are being strengthened. The second thing is that China's export, at least since the last 2 months, since June and July, has increased. Just in terms of, for China's concern, China's position in the world trade system has been strengthened, not been weakened. The only thing that sounds like a decoupling is in the technological side. That issue cannot be resolved in the short term because technology is linked with strategic rivalry between the United States and China. And this rivalry is going to last for a long, long time. It really doesn't matter who's going to be the American president. This strategic rivalry will still be there.
Mr. Wolf, what is likely to be this, decoupling effect on the global supply chains? Have anybody really done any serious research about what it would take?
I mean, I would pick one that people don't usually think about because I also am a university professor, but the United States has gotten massive cultural influence, and a pillar of American global leadership has been our export of degrees. And actually, college degrees and university degrees are one of the leading exports of the United States, both in terms of dollars and employment in the United States, and most certainly in terms of American influence. And if you look at aggressive actions being taken by the United States to make it less desirable, more uncomfortable, more difficult for people around the world to come here, I think it threatens the scientific leadership of the United States, questions American cultural leadership in the world. So while I do think that so far the world keeps moving, we are in a suspended animation here with huge government subsidies and the sort of trying to figure out what COVID or post-COVID begins to look like. And we won't really begin to see the new post-COVID sort of less cooperative, less globalized economy until that mud gets out of the economic water. And I think that some industries will be relatively unscathed. Others, I think, will be really hard hit, whether that's American soybeans or the university systems. And my guess is whole facets of life are going to change uncomfortably fast. Okay. And I think the track we're on makes for a smaller, more hostile, less affluent world where there's less the sort of meritocracy that comes from global competition.
Before we go, I would like to invite very briefly from every one of you gentlemen, when we talk about trade and economic ties between China and the United States, what exactly are we talking about today? Professor Huang.
I think we started off initially talking about trade and products as being the big issue. I think today the big issue is the exchange of knowledge, technology. That's much more important than trade. And I think that has global implications because it's the knowledge transfer that drives growth. When you start to restrict it, everyone suffers.
Professor Yao in Beijing.
If I may, I still want to say the two countries should sit down and then talk about two issues. One is how to create a rule-based relationship. Second, how to reach what I should call grand bargaining to resolve the technological issues and other economic issues in a whole basket.
Mr. Wolf, Professor.
So look, I still think that the United States and China need each other, maybe now more than ever. We need some sort of agreement to help get the world over what is going to be a very serious recession that in most places hasn't started yet and will cut deep and long. I think we need the cooperation, but I have to say, just being honest, Trump is a symptom of a series of problems in the U.S. He's not the disease. He's quite an aggressive symptom, but he's still a symptom. And if we want the better future together, we need to treat the disease, not just the symptom.
Max Wolf, Yao Yang, Yu Kong Huang, thank you so much, gentlemen. Be well. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on the program, Trump and Pompeo call for an ideological Cold War between China and the United States. Can cooperation prevail, though, over competition? I speak to a Chinese scholar who advocates political wisdom to rise above the choppy discourse.
We are living in an increasingly fragile international system.
Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Trump and U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo have been at the forefront of shifting China-U.S. ties from trade partners to strategic rivals. They have also framed this rivalry as a competition of ideology and governance. How will China respond to this provocation? And how will the rest of the world react to an economic decoupling and an unstable U.S.-led world order? To find out, I speak to Chen Dongxiao, president of the Shanghai Institute of International Studies. He gives me a framework as to how China is looking at the overall situation and its future relation with the United States. latest news suggests that there is a coalition of the willing, quote-unquote, that is aspired to be built by the current Secretary of State of the United States. Now, under that circumstances, what does that mean for China-U.S. relations? What's your latest take?
Well, I think that from those hawkish members in White House, represented by the Secretary of State, Mr. Pompeo, who tried to build up such kind of anti-China, or put it more precisely, anti-Communist Party, Chinese Communist Party coalition around the world. And I think that they tried to conjure up the concept, or reconstruct the concept of so-called ideological war or confrontation with what they called a kind of a tyranny governmental regime in Beijing, and they tried to mobilize those domestic sources or forces as well as international forces to try to roll back of what they called a China threat. I think that such kind of rhetorics only reminded me of those Cold War rhetoric, which has been already opposed and rejected categorically by Chinese people, by Chinese government, as well as many reasonable people, many statesmen, politicians around the world.
When one side really want to do it, a Cold War, even though do not necessarily represent the overall population of the United States, but what can China do really?
Today's world is quite different from what Mr. Pompeo's depiction or narratives of kind of a new Cold War with China. For very obvious reasons, we are still living in a very globalized world. Interdependence, hyperconnectivity are still the defining feature of our today's world. Even if some people in Washington, those hawkish peoples, they try to pursue the policy of so-called decoupling with China. But I think that the reality is the reality. But more importantly, we're also living in a world of the diversity or pluralistic mode of development. So I think that when those people who try to say that the world will be polarized or divided into the so-called democratic countries or world versus non-democratic countries or world, I think such kind of a very simplistic framework does not catch up or does not comprehend this very complex, interdependent world. What I mean by saying the increasingly fragile or vulnerable international system, which means that the human beings' social-political system are increasingly connected with the biological system.
Logically, what you just said, and theoretically, really sound, but the reality looks the other way around. For example, some say it's all about hard power competition now between China and the United States. Don't look away from this reality. And China, as a result, you argue in your article also that it's not symmetrical. It's actually an asymmetrical competition between China and the United States. Tell me more about that.
In the past few years, there's a growing extent of the competition, or even strategic competition, between our bilateral relationship. We have to admit that this strategic competition largely reflected by the two dimensions. One is that it should be understood under the framework of a global or international power shift, that those transatlantic or US-dominated international order has been increasingly replaced by a multipolarization. And the rising of those non-transatlantic, non-Western powers have increasingly transit from their roles taking to the position of rose making. And therefore, this is a geopolitical or global power structure shift. And the United States represents a kind of relative decline of the force. And China represents the other side. So this is the main reason underpinning the concept why this bilateral relationship has increasingly have the dimension of a strategic competition. Chinese socialist system has improved, upgraded, and developed. And therefore, Chinese people are also confident, more confident in this system we have chosen. While at the same time, kind of by contrast, we have seen that there have been a more economic, social, and political system problems coming out of the American mode of domestic governance. And we have seen still quite serious racial problems, and seen so many demonstrations in the United States and even social unrest. So I think that the United States is politically much more polarized, and economically, its distribution of welfare system is not so unfair. It's very unfair.
Right.
And also, we have also seen the diminishing or the declining of middle class in the United States. So these are all the domestic problems for the American domestic governance. And in this kind of contrast, for many American colleagues, particularly for those hawkish people who try to divert the attention from their poor performance, including their poor performance responding to the pandemic, they try to, conjure up a kind of a fear that all those problems are coming out of the shock or challenge from China.
So why is it asymmetrical and why is it imbalanced?
Well, I think that the asymmetrical should be understood in three dimensions. In dimension of perception of both sides, and in the dimension of the instruments that both sides apply, as well as in dimension of the domestic ecosystem of each other, particularly regarding the decision-making on each other's policy towards each other. For the first aspect, I think that both sides, I think that Washington and Beijing has a gulf gap of perception, of understanding the nature of the strategic competition. For instance, from Washington's perspective, their overwhelming narrative, particularly carried by those hawkish members in the White House as well as in Congress, they try to define this relationship as a kind of as I said, ideological war, or a primacy, it's a primacy struggle, or game for primacy. And they also regard Washington played the role of a guardian or guarantor of the Western or American ideology or liberal institution or liberal ideology. So this is their definition about the strategic competition. Well, I think Beijing categorically rejected that narrative because China has no strategic intention and planning of exporting or transplanting the Chinese mode of development, of governance around the world. And it's also not in China's strategic planning or intention to try to engage with U.S. in a so-called a Cold War, ideological war. So this is a big difference of perception. The second aspect of the asymmetrical side is the instruments. Washington nowadays has carried out its so-called strategic competition with China with all its whole of government means. Political smearing, economic decoupling, science technology boycotting, and also security or military rolling back. So they have applied all kinds of means through the so-called maximum pressures. And this is the reason we have seen that there are a series of those hardliner policies on China almost day by day. While from Chinese perspective, I think that we mainly focus on those areas of competition, on how to continue to improve our economic development and the science and technology competitiveness. And we also focus on how to improve or develop Chinese own domestic governance. So I think that if we compare the instruments of how to understand, how to carry on those competition, the both sides have quite a diverse stress and emphasis. And the last but not least is the quite a diverse political atmosphere of two sides. For Washington, I think that particularly nowadays, because this the presidential election has intensified the uncertainty and unpredictability of Americans' political atmosphere. And I think that those intensity of those election, while also the sitting government increasingly frustrated about the performance and the declining of its support, will make those decision-making on China even more dramatic, risk-taking, and unpredictable.
China's reform and opening up has been closely linked to China's normalizing relation with the United States. In fact, that was done almost at the same time in the 1970s with China's reform and opening up decision. And over the past 4-5 decades, China's development has a lot to do with its opening door, its ever more intertwined relationship with the United States, its involvement on the international platforms. Now, if one of those factors is being taken away, particularly China-U.S. relations, from partner to a certain extent to real competition and even rivalry, what would that mean to the other factors of our development?
But we should not forget that actually this relationship is very complex. And don't forget there is still a huge area or even potential area for our cooperation and for partnership. The challenge for us is nowadays, on the current administration of the U.S., that those areas for cooperation has been almost suspended unilaterally by the United States. Even China has been trying very hard to try to work with the U.S. on many important areas, either bilaterally or multilaterally. So I think that the reality is we, of course, would not, it is not in the Chinese interest to pursue the so-called new Cold War with U.S. We will continue, because this kind of new Cold War has focused too much on so-called ideological differences or even confrontation. And it is also largely coming out of U.S. domestic politics. But I don't think that it will succeed, because China rejects the idea, this ideological war, and China is only interested in its own development. And China also has no interest to export its mode of governance around the world. And we focus on the mutual learning, including the mutual learning of different countries' mode of development, including the United States. And I also believe that the other players, including many Americans' allies and partners, they are not ready to side either with the U.S. or with China, because they don't think that it is in their interest to side with either side or against another. Even in the United States, now we have seen that the sitting government, particularly its hawkish members, they try to frame this bilateral relationship with this overwhelming rhetorics of narratives of Cold War or ideological confrontation.
Right.
But I think that for many reasonable people, as well as many business people, still have a close economic relationship with China. They don't think that it is in their interest to join this force of anti-China or engage with the so-called new Cold War with China. From Chinese perspective, I think that while we understand that there will be a more pressure from U.S. side to try to roll back of what they believe a kind of a China challenge. Mm. And we will respond with firmness as well as rationality.
Right.
We try to strike a good balance between firmness and rationality. And if we compare the statements of our Foreign Minister Wang Yi's and U.S. State Secretary Pompeo's, it's not so difficult to find that the Trump administration has been gone all out to provoking, whereas Chinese government reacted with firmness and calmness.
Chen Dongxiao, president of the Shanghai Institute of International Studies. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, search our program, World Insight, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.